Hello and welcome to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line, starting out in the Robotic direction, where the Ukrainian forces have yet again managed to advance further in the direction of Novoprokopivka. We see here through the positions map mode that the Ukrainian forces have managed to capture most of the trenches here to the south of the village of Robotic, with only the western parts staying in the gray zone, as it being in neither side's control. So what we're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces have managed to advance here in the eastern parts of Robotic and down south in the direction of Novoprokopivka. It has been obvious for a couple of days now that the Ukrainian forces are focusing on the eastern parts of Robotic, allowing them to traverse through the low grounds here and then moving upwards through their positions here to the south to bypass the Russian defenses here in the north, in the southern direction of Robotic. With this, the Ukrainian forces have now managed to go around and flank the Russian positions south of Robotic, which is most likely why we're seeing them advancing and pushing the Russians out of these trenches from the eastern side of the village rather than the northern side. So the Ukrainians are trying their best to gain the most possible advantages through the disadvantageous position they started out with. Now they are pushing towards the high ground in the direction of Novoprokopivka. If we take a look at the topographic map, we can see that the Ukrainian positions here to the east of Novoprokopivka are still in the low ground, but they're moving slightly towards the up and high ground areas between the villages of Robotic and Novoprokopivka. The current fighting is happening by the trenches here to the south of Robotic, which are at the highest point in the area. And then we see a bit of the fighting happening in the forests east of this location. So the Ukrainian forces are looking to capture this forest. If they manage to capture this forest, there's this final forest line between the Ukrainian positions and Novoprokopivka, after which we'll most likely see them going around the positions, capturing the final trenches, and then moving southwards from Robotic in the direction of Novoprokopivka. There are also the trenches here to the west of Robotic, both in the western side of the village and also to the southwest, going through the high ground towards Kupani. So what we're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces will most likely not go for these trenches, but they'll continue southwards in the direction of Novoprokopivka and then down south to the main line of defense, which is also located at the high ground. So the Ukrainian forces will look to capture Novoprokopivka, as it is also located in the high ground, after which they will follow the high ground down southeast towards the Russian main line of defense and also towards Ivankova, which is here in the southwestern parts in the direction of the main line of defense. So the Russian forces are here having trenches to the south of it and to the east of it. So the Russian main line of defense follows the high ground, which is located at about 160 meters, and the Ukrainian forces are currently located at about 98 meters. So a 60-meter height elevation difference. It's not much, but it makes a big enough difference on the field for them to have an advantage through this and give the Ukrainians a disadvantage. And any small advantage / disadvantage makes a huge difference in the long run, especially since the fighting has been ongoing for 3 months in this area. As for the fighting here in the direction of Novoprokopivka, there has been some geolocated images by Deep State Map, which shows some fighting very close by to the direction of Novoprokopivka. The Ukrainian forces have managed to reach the areas here to the southeast of Robotic, which allows them to now have positions closer towards Novoprokopivka, and the fighting is now taking place in the direction of the forest lines that are to the east of the villages, and as such the Ukrainian forces are increasing their pressure on the high ground here to the northeast of Novoprokopivka as they try to contest these high grounds positions that the Russians are holding on to, trying to defend the villages. We then move on to the next part of the front, which is here by the Velika Novosilka direction. The Ukrainian forces continue their offensive operations in this direction, and it seems their focus is now around Novomayorsk. According to the latest reports by Deep State Map, we see that the Ukrainian forces have managed to enter the village. There has been some videos that were geolocated to be Russian artillery hitting Ukrainian positions within the village, and as such the Ukrainians have started getting a foothold. It is still in the gray zone as there's heavy fighting over the area, but fighting has reached across the river line and towards Novomayorsk, meaning the Ukrainian forces now have a presence within the village. So the ongoing fighting here in this direction is advancing for the favor of the Ukrainians as they're managing to enter the village of Novomayorsk. And in relation to the latest developments here in the southern front and throughout Ukraine, but most specifically the Ukrainian offensive, the US General Mark Milley, chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, is being briefed on the tactical situation in Ukraine. So as we can see in this picture here, they are showcasing the videos of DPA and me as we report on the latest developments on the front line, and they are talking with each other, communicating and debating our theories and developments, latest reports. Just kidding, this is the unedited photo, and as we can see, they are using these maps just like us. They don't have any special techniques or items. Of course, they have some real-time satellite imagery and all of these things, but they are also basing their strategy, their advice, and their reports on these maps, which shows exactly what the front looks like. And if we take a look at these maps, we see that they are very close to what my own map says. This is actually outdated, so they are behind what we actually report ourselves. But we can see that the units reported in the area are very close to what we see in Deep State Map, and in other open sources we see that there are actually more Ukrainian units than what is reported by Military Land. So there are some short and small differences, but mostly we actually have fairly accurate information. This just shows how unpredictable war is and the significance of the open source community intelligence we actually have. The fact that we can get such close information to what the reality actually is like is very significant and has probably never been seen before in the history of mankind. The Ukrainian forces have definitely restarted their operations here in the direction of Vyathatki, Kamyansk and so on, as they have managed to capture some of these positions to the north of Serbianki. So most likely the Ukrainian forces are looking to flank the Russian positions here in this area. The fortifications of the Russian forces here are very intricate. They are very separate, spread around, and there's essentially minefields and fortifications all over this whole area. So I haven't had the time to map it out clearly, but I'll show you some other time. But essentially the Ukrainian forces advancing such a small distance here is very significant compared to other areas, as here there are a lot of fortifications and it's much more difficult than in a random normal open field. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainian forces advancing in this direction means that they have started some actual effort in this direction. Now, we have talked a lot about the reserves of the Ukrainian forces. How many forces do they actually have available? And if we take a look at this article here, there's actually some bad news for Ukraine, and that is, in a recent development, the United States Army has prolonged a training initiative designed to equip Ukrainian personnel with the skills to operate M1A1 Abrams tanks. As per announcement from US Army Europe and Africa Command, the program originally slated for completion in mid-September is now projected to experience a delay of several weeks. So while we assumed the Abrams tanks would arrive in mid-September, now it is likely to be delayed much further to, at the earliest, October, probably much later, as they are saving several weeks, and that is likely a long time. And this is actually very bad news for Ukraine, because if we take a look at this article here by Danish media outlet, we see that US General Milley actually says that the Ukrainian forces only have about 1 month left before the Rasputitsa phenomenon kicks in and the muddy season begins, which would make it very difficult for them to actually push through in their current offensive. Specifies there are probably around 30 to 45 days of fighting weather left, he says, and the explanation is simple. The rain will come, it will be really muddy, and will be very difficult to maneuver at that time. As I've mentioned in a previous video, the Ukrainian forces in such a scenario would be forced to move through the roads rather than the open fields and so on, which they have mainly used to advance. If we take a look at the main road, the distance the Ukrainian forces have advanced is significantly less than if we look through the open fields, and we actually see that the main thrust is being put in the direction of Verbove and Robotine, And through the Robotic Direction, we've hardly seen any progress. They've managed to capture one village after 3 months. As for the Robotic Direction, they haven't really captured anything, but they've advanced a further distance. And we also see here down to the southeast of Robotic, they've passed through and bypassed the defenses. So these open fields are actually very significant for the Ukrainian forces if they want to advance. So this is the opinion of General Milley. What about this Danish general? Well, what he says is that it's typically the Americans, they think you can only carry out breakthrough operations with armored units, which can get stuck in the mud. But that is not how the Ukrainians work now, he states. So how do the Ukrainians actually work now? And this is also something that I've been covering. I've covered it in the first few weeks of the offensive. After the initial armored convoy assaults, which ended horrendously, as is also said by this Danish colonel general, they changed and switched up to another strategy where they heavily focused on transporting infantry to these forest patches and then let them dismount the vehicles, allow them to push through these forest patches, set up positions, and then there is reinforcements by these armored vehicles that drive through the areas that are already cleared. So these infantry clear the mines, and they also set up ATGMs as well as anti-air defenses and so on, so that they're able to establish positions in these areas. So this is why the progress has been very slow, and this is also why we have seen that although the armored casualties decreased, there would be significantly more infantry casualties. So what is said by this Danish Colonel General is that, Brigadier General, what he says is that the Ukrainians started with this extensive use of armored vehicles and tanks, but as he puts it, it went to hell. For example, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed on June 5th that they had destroyed 16 tanks, 3 infantry fighting vehicles, and 21 armored fighting vehicles. This is a day after the offensive began. The offensive began on June 4th, as I was reporting. So the Ukrainian forces had significant losses on the very first day. So what actually happened? Why have they changed? And how does this bypass mud? So he claims that when they bypass using armored vehicles as the main force and use infantry as the main force, the infantry can just walk through the mud. That is no issue for them. However, the issue here lies, how do these infantry get to the front? They have to go through these infantry fighting vehicles. They have to use these APCs to transport them to the front. And in those situations, these vehicles can get stuck in the mud. If the infantry just completely dismantles them, don't use them at all, just walk the whole distance from the areas and positions they are at and then all the way down to the front line, that is very tough, and they'll be out in the open for so long. So if the Russians just launch artillery strikes, they can hit them somewhere along that distance, which if we take a look at Deep State map, it is approximately 9 kilometers. So if you want to walk 9 kilometers through the open fields without any armored vehicles to transport you all the way down, then you will most likely get hit by artillery along the way. There is the thing that during the fall season, there's going to be a lot more rain, so drones and Air Force will have much less time to operate, and as such, these infantry could go unnoticed most of the way, but there should still be scouts, there should still be other things, and if the infantry cannot get the armored reserve, armored reinforcements that they need when they are actually engaging in the combat, then there's also issues there. So while the point stands that Ukraine is now mainly using infantry, the armored support and tanks are still very significant for the process and progress of the Ukrainian forces. They cannot just be disregarded. So although I'm Danish, I'm going to have to stick with the US general on this one. So that is general idea. There were some issues here and there, and according to this article, the Ukrainians also acknowledge that there are some problems. For example, Budanov says to the BBC, the fighting will continue one way or another. So essentially they say, even if we have to cancel this offensive, it ends, we have had no success, they will still keep fighting until they eventually get some success. But this is what you call banging your head up against a wall. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.